Hello, friends. Welcome to Literary Concepts. Today's topic is the Georgian Age, which is started in 1910 and ended in 1936. Now, let us try to learn more about the Georgian Age. The Georgian Age in English literature refers to the period from 1910 to 1936. So the Georgian Age occurred between 1910 to 1936, which was happened during the reign of King George V. So this Georgian age occurred during the rule of the King George V. So that is from 1910 to 1936. At the same time, we also find some influence of King George IV. Okay, we also find some influence of King George IV on the writings and writers of the Georgian age. So it is the Georgian age is served as a bridge between the Edwardian period and the modernist movements that emerged after World War One. So it is worked as a bridge between the Edwardian period and the modernist movement which happened after the World War One. So the name Georgian is derived from a series of poetry anthologies published by Edward Marsh. So Edward Marsh published a series of poetry anthologies. He published anthologies from his work titled Georgian Poetry, which was written between 1912 to 1922. So, from Georgian poetry, the name Georgian is derived, which presented the works of the contemporary poets. So, this Georgian poetry, written by Edward Marsh, presented showcased the works of contemporary poets. So the Georgian time was a significant. Uh, we find social, political, and cultural disturbances during the Georgian age. So now let us try to understand the characteristics of Georgian age. The first one is focus on nature and rural life. So we find there is a focus on nature and rural life. Georgian poets, they celebrate it, the beauty of the English countryside and the simplicity of rural life. So we find the beauty of English countryside and the simplicity of rural life in the Georgian poetry, offering a sense of escapism. So they escaped from the uh, industrialization and the conflicts of the time, the issues and the problems of the particular time, and the industrialization, the influence of industrialization. So they escaped from these influence and they focused more on the nature and the rural life. The next characteristic is reaction against Victorian formality. So it is very evident that if you find the modernist movement, understand, this Georgian age is also part of the modernist movement. So we find there is against the Victorian formality. The writers of the Georgian age, they wanted to move away from moralizing and rigid forms of Victorian literature. So they just want to quit that moralizing and the strict forms of Victorian literature, and they were attracted more to the personal, introspective, and emotional themes. So they embraced more to personal, introspective, and emotional themes in their writings. The next characteristic is pre war optimism and post war disillusionment. So, the early Georgian literature, the early writers of Georgian period, they reflected a sense of nostalgia and idealism, a sense of looking back to the past, understand, and That is the sentimental longing for the past events and idealism. The early Georgian poets, okay, the early Georgian literature reflected that pre-war optimism. So something hopeless, hopeful. Sorry, optimism means hopefulness, having something positive, positivity. So therefore, they reflected a sense of nostalgia, okay, remembering the past events and idealism, while the works of later, okay, which produced during the after World War One. So after World War One, whatever the works published, okay, produced, they captured, they recorded the trauma and despair and disillusionment caused by the conflict. So the works which were published after the World War One, so they uh, recorded, they focused more on the trauma, that is the distressing, the deep trauma means deeply disturbing experiences and distressing experiences, and the despairs and disillusionment. So that is a deep disappointment caused by World War One. So the next characteristic is experimentation with the form. While many Georgian poets so followed the traditional verse forms. So many Georgian poets they adhered to, they stick to traditional poetic forms, but some began experimenting with new styles. So some of them they started, they used the experimentation with new style of writings, new verse forms, and they were anticipating, expecting the modernist innovations of writers like T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. So this is a experimentation with farm. The next characteristic is interest in ordinary life. So Georgian writers often depicted the everyday experiences of ordinary people. So they focused more on the common experiences of ordinary people, everyday experiences. So particularly giving more focusing on their joys, struggles, and interactions with the changing times, understand the changing world. The next characteristic is themes of war and loss. So the devastations, the damages happened due to the World War One deeply influenced Georgian literature. Okay, the World War One damages and devastations. So we find the destructions, whatever happened due to World War One. So the influence of World War One is more on Georgian literature, and war poetry became a dominant form. So, war poetry has become a dominant form and exploring the theme of heroism, sacrifice, futility, and the horrors of the battle. So, we find the themes like heroism, sacrifice, futility. Futility means that is uselessness, okay, and the horrors of the battle. The next characteristic is a transition to modernism. So it is a transition, transformation, okay, to modernism. Although Georgian literature is often associated with the traditional styles, with it also saw the emergence of modernist themes. So Georgian literature always associated with traditional styles, but however we find the emergence of modernist themes and techniques, especially in the works of writers reacting to the disillusionment of war. So particularly uh, in the writings of the writers, so who reacted against the disillusionment, the disappointment of the war, the devastations of the World War One. So these are the characteristics of the Georgian age, the Georgian period. Now let us try to understand the major writers and their works of Georgian period. The first writer is Rupert Brooke, whose lifespan started in 1887 and ended in 1915. So Brooke's poetry reflects the idealism and patriotism. So Rupert Brooke's poetry focused more on idealism and patriotism of the early stages of World War One. His important works are, the first work is The Soldier, which was published in 1915. So it was a poignant, very touching and patriotic sonnet that idealizes sacrifice for one's country. So very touching and patriotic sonnet. The Soldier was published in 1915. The one more work writing is 1914 and Other Poems. This was also published in 1915. So it is a collection of poems, so capturing the pre-war optimism and romanticized notions of war in the 1914 and Other Poems. These are the soldiers, and 1914 and Other Poems are the important works of Rupert Brooke. The next writer is Siegfried Sassoon, so whose lifespan started in 1886 and ended in 1967. Sassoon's war poetry is known for its stark realism and sketching criticism of the horrors of trench warfare. Understand? So we find the sharp realism and the harsh criticism of the horrors of that that trench, the drain of war. Okay, so Sassoon's important works are, the first one is Counter Attack and Other Poems, which was published in 1918. So it was a collection exposing the brutality and futility of war. So this collection of poems exposed the brutalities, the cruelty and futility of war. The next work is The Old Man Huntsman. The Old Huntsman, which was published in 1917. So it is a mix of war poems. So The Old Huntsman is a mix of war poems and reflections on pre-war life. So reflections focused on pre-war life. The next writer is Wilfred Owen, whose time period started in 1893 and ended in 1918. So Owen is regarded as one of the greatest war poets. Wilfred Owen is considered as one of the greatest war poets who captured the physical and emotional toll of the World War One. So physical and emotional record of the World War One with vivid imagery and empathy. So graphic imagery and empathy. So his important work is, the first one is Dells at Decorum Est, which was published in 1920. So it was a powerful anti-war poem exposing the grim realities of combat. The gloomy realities of the war. The next work is Anthem for Doomed Youth, which was also published in 1920. So, a lament for the soldiers. It was a lament for the soldiers, so who lost in war. Understand that? The next writer is Edward Thomas, whose lifespan started in 1878 and ended in 1917. He was a poet who celebrated nature and the English countryside. So Thomas' works reflect a deep sense of melancholy and introspection. So his works focused more on the sense of melancholy, the sadness, and introspection, the self examination. Edward Thomas Important works are, the first one is Edelstrop, which was published in 1917. So it was a nostalgic and contemplative poem. Edelstrop was a nostalgic and contemplative poem about the brief moment in a rural setting. The next work is Rain, which was published in 1916. So it was a poignant meditation on isolation and mortality. So it was a pitiful meditation on isolation and mortality, temporariness. The next writer is Walter de la Mure. So Walter de la Mure, whose time period started in 1873 and ended in 1956. So Lamour is known for his lyrical and atmospheric poetry, so often explored the themes of childhood, imagination, and supernatural elements. So his important works are, the first one is The Listeners, which was published in 1912. It was a haunting narrative poem about unanswered questions and the unknown. The next work is Peacock Pie, which was published in 1913. It was a collection of whimsical and fantastical poems for children. So it was a collection of whimsical, fanciful, and fantastical imaginatory poems for children. The next writer is E.M. Forster's, so whose time period started in 1879 and ended in 1917. Foster's continued to writing during the Georgian period. So Foster, he was continued during the Edwardian period. He wrote and he continued to write even during Georgian period. So the themes of social class, human connection, and cultural conflicts we find in the writings of E.M. Forster's. His important work is A Passage to India, which was published in 1924. So it was a novel which examines the complexities of British Indian relationships during colonial rule. So which focused on the complexities, the difficulties of British Indian relationships during the colonial rule. The next writer is H.G. Wells, whose time period started in 1866. So and okay, ended in 1946. H.G. Wells also, he was also, uh, we find in Edwardian time. At the same time, in Georgian time also, he continued writing. So he wrote novels critiquing societal norms, the societal customs and norms. He criticized exploring the futuristic and fantastical themes, the futuristic elements and fantastical elements we find in his works. His important work is The History of Mr. Polly, which was published in 1910. So it was a comedic and yet poignant novel, so about man seeking escape from his dull life. The next writer is D.H. Lawrence, whose time period started in 1885 and ended in 1930. So Lawrence works often delve into the human psychology. So he was digging into, okay, you just find that a deep search into the human psychology and relationships and the conflict between industrialization and nature. His important works are the number one, Sons and Lovers, which was published in 1913. So it was a semi autobiographical novel about family, love, and personal growth. The next work is The Rainbow, which was published in 1915. It was a multi generational novel exploring individual freedom and emotional fulfillment. The next writer is Virginia Woolf, so whose time period started in 1882 and ended in 1941. So even though she was associated with modernism, Woolf began her career during the Georgian Age. Virginia Woolf, so she is associated with modernism, but her career was started during the Georgian Age and experimenting with narrative techniques and psychological depth. Her important work is Jacob's Room, which was published in 1922, a novel that blends Georgian sensibilities with modernist experimentations. So we find that Georgian sensibilities, the sensitive aspects, with the modernist experimentation. So these are the important writers and their works of Georgian age, Georgian period. I hope you understand this. Thank you very much.